What's your story? Maybe you're not sure what it is. Maybe you know what it is. But unless you have ears to hear what your story is saying, you'll miss it. That's what we want to talk about today as we continue our series, God's Story, Your Story. Becoming the man you were designed to be in the biggest story ever told. Now again, the purpose of our series is to help you and I become the men that God has designed us to be. And to do that, we want to understand, first of all, God's story. That God has a larger story that He is telling. And we want to also not only understand God's story, but we also want to know what our story is, our smaller story, as we want to put it. And we want to understand God's larger story, know our smaller story, so that we can begin to learn to live into God's story. And the reason we want to learn to live into God's story is because the Bible says as we learn to live into God's story, with our story, it's then that we become wise in our life. We're able to live according to the way God is designed because we are walking in step with God. And when we walk in step with God, centered in God, our lives flourish and we live according to our design. But when we fail to do that, the Bible says we live foolish lives. Why? Because we are going in a different direction than God is going in, and we're always going to be bumping into what we've called creational reality. And when you bump into reality, that's what hurts. And so what we feel, all the pain we feel in life, all the things that go on in life, a lot of it is because we are walking in a direction that God's story is not going in. So we want to learn to live into God's story by first understanding what God's story is, but to understand but to live into God's story, we not only have to do that, we have to know our own story. So that's what we want to begin to do today. The outline of the series, this is our fourth of the six. The first three were under the heading God's Story. And we saw history as God's story. Second, we saw that how God tells a story. Third, the story God is telling. And then today we begin the second half, your story. And what we want to do today, how your story was formed. Next time, not all stories are created equal. And then the last session, 6, living into God's story. Now what we've seen so far, if we can just give a review, we saw that God is directing all of human history, past, present, and future, in the telling of a transcendent, larger, overarching narrative or story in which He is making all things new. We also saw that God's story is being told in a forward linear movement, not cyclical, like our own culture is telling today, like we saw all the different religions through the pagan religions through the past have told their stories. But it's a forward linear movement that He is using three themes: innocence, tragedy, and resolution. And then we saw that God uses innocence and tragedy, specifically in our own stories, to open our idolatrous hearts. They're idolatrous because we saw that we trust in other things rather than God to make our lives work. He wants to open our idolatrous hearts to the depths of His grace. God is good, we saw, but He's a whole lot better than we could ever imagine. And He wants us to know how good He is so that we can learn to trust God with our own lives and with the resolution He wants to bring not only to our story, but to the whole world, all of human history. And if we put it into kind of a picture that you can see, here we have God's larger story, and it encompasses all of human history, past, present, and future. It's moving in a forward linear movement, and it has three themes: innocence, that was in Genesis 1 through 2, life with God in Eden. And then there was the tragedy, the fall, life without God outside of Eden. And then there is resolution, life with God again, not just in a Garden of Eden, but we see Revelation 21 and 22 in an Edenic world. The whole world becomes a place of God's presence and glory. And this resolution, what God is doing is this is where he is working in human history to make all things new. He's going to make all things right, and is going to take what's wrong and restore it to the way God meant it to be. And how he does that is beyond anything we could ever imagine. It isn't how we could have imagined God would do it. He does it not through might and strength, but he does it through the suffering of the cross. The grace of the cross, which not only forgives our sin, but Colossians 1 tells us it defeats evil and works to bring justice. And it says in 1 Corinthians that if the rulers and powers of this world, this darkness, Satan and his host, knew that the cross was going to do all this, he says they wouldn't have crucified him. But that's God's hidden wisdom that Paul says is behind God's story. Now, we define God's story then by God's story is his seen and unseen movement in the world. He's not out there and left the world alone. He's moving in this world in ways that we see and ways that we don't see, by which he is sovereignly orchestrating all of human history, past, present, and future, towards a future glorious day. What is that day? It's a day when evil will be finally defeated and judged, and all things, you and I and all of life and creation, are fully restored and made new. And how is it done? Through the crucified and risen Jesus, who is God's unique Son. He's not just some man. He's God's unique Son, God himself, Israel's promised Messiah, the one that God from the very beginning, Genesis 3, said he would bring to make all things new, to take what was wrong and make it right, and the world's true Lord. Caesar is not Lord. The U.S. government is not Lord. China is not Lord. Jesus right now is the true Lord. Why? Because he is risen bodily from the dead, and he is orchestrating and over all things in this world today. That's God's story. And we get to be part of that. And this series is all about learning to live into that story. Now, today's topic, session 4, how your story was shaped and formed. Or another way to put it, why you are the way you are. Okay, we want to look at that today. You ever wonder why you are the way you are? And why a sibling is so different than you, or why your friends are so different than you? Why is it the way you are? It all goes back to how your story was shaped and formed. And our purpose today, again, is to help you understand your story by asking 4 questions. And here are the questions. Number 1, when we talk about story, what is your story? I said if we had ears to hear, we would hear Simba's story, because Simba was telling his story right there. This has to do with essence. What is the essence of man's story, of your story? Second, how is your story being told? And this has to do with vehicle. There's a way that we tell our story. And then the third question is, where was your story formed? This has to do, obviously, with its origin. Where did it all begin? And then finally and lastly, how can your story be known? This has to do with process. It isn't just something you create. It isn't just something you make up. It isn't just something you read about and determine, oh, that's my story right there. It's a process of which we come to know what our story is. Okay, so those 4 questions. So with that in mind, let's ask the first one. What is your story? How would you answer that? What is your story? No takers? Well, your story, let me tell you what it's not first. Your story is not your life history. It's not, this happened, I was born, then this happened, then this happened, and this happened, then I got married, and here I am today. That's not your story. Those are simply the events of your life. And the story is not your history. Your story is not your CV or your resume, all your accomplishments. Your story is not your personal testimony. I didn't really have a story until I got saved, and now I got a story because Jesus is here and he's taken away my sin and he's given me a new way to think about life. That's not your story. It can be part of your story. Your CV can be part of your story. Your history is part of your story, but it's not your story. And your story is not your family tree. 4 generations happened and 3 generations and this, and my dad and this, and my kids. And that's part of your story, but it's not your story. When we talk about your story, what is your story if it's not these things? Well, a good way to put it is this. Your story is your default operating system. Now, it may be Windows or maybe something else, but it's your default operating system. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what's a default operating system? Well, it's a computer language, and the internet describes or defines the default operating system as this. It's a pre-designed setting used by a computer when a setting is not specified by the system user. What does all that mean? Well, it means maybe something like this. It's how a computer is set up to automatically function. You turn on the computer, and if you don't do anything to it, this is how it's going to function every time you turn it on. If you push this button, this happens. If you push this button, this happens. It's how your computer automatically functions is all based upon your computer's default operating system. And notice it says it's based on a factory preset. Comes from the factory like this. And it can be changed, but the user has to be the one to change it. And if you try to change it, sometimes you wish you didn't change it. And sometimes you're really not sure. And so you got to call people like Mark to help you do that. But that's a default operating system. Now let's apply this to your story. What is your story? Well, if your default operating system, as your default operating system, your story is the way we automatically think and behave and react to life. It's our knee-jerk response to life. That's our story. It's based on our own unique factory preset, and we'll talk about where that factory preset happens. And it's always going to be like that unless you specifically and purposefully do something about it. It isn't going to actually change. It will always be your default setting unless you do something about it. So your story is the way you automatically think, behave, and react to life. It's your knee-jerk response to life. Now, if that's true, then what that means is this. Your story is how you drive to work every morning. Your story is the tone of your voice toward your wife and kids. Your story is told by how you make decisions under pressure. Your story is manifest by the way you handle and spend money. Your story is the attitude that you have towards an unfair situation. Or it's your body language when you interact with another person. Your story is the expectations you have with a friend. And your story is even the things you ask for and don't ask for in prayer. That's your story. Why? Because that is your default operating system. It's how you automatically think and believe and act and react to life. That has been preset in you from the factory, and it will always be that way unless you do something to change it. Men talk about change a lot, and so that's a big thing, especially for Christian men. I want to change. I don't want to be the way I was. And yet they have a hard time changing, and they'll work hard for a little while, and they always go back to the way they were. Well, it's because they don't know how to change the factory preset. You got to know what the factory preset is and then know how to change it. Not just want to, but know how to change it. We're going to talk about that today. So that's your story. What is your story? What is it, guys?
Default operating system.
It's your default operating system. It's your knee-jerk reaction to life. Second, how is your story being told? And here we want to talk about the vehicle. How is your story being told? Answer? How is Simba's story being told? Well, he was a victim, but we heard it through his story. He was telling his story through a self-protective style of relating. He had a difficult background, right? Remember how his father died? What was it? Scar killed his father, and he saw it, and all of this, and so Simba's story, how he dealt with it, was what? Hakuna Matata. I just won't think about it. And when he did think about it, where did he go? Shame. It was my fault. And what did he think about the future? Nobody wants me. There's no hope. You can't change the past. So you're stuck in the past. So what do? It's just a revolving circle, so just avoid it. That's his story. And it was being told through a self-protective relational style. I don't know how to deal with what has happened to me in the past, so I will form a way of relating that I don't have to think about it. Now, what's a self-protective style of relating? It's the vehicle through which broken men interact with the broken world. It's your relational armor. That's how we engage life. Our story is told through our relational armor. Now, there's a good description of a self-protective relational style in the book of Isaiah, chapter 50, verses 10 and 11. Listen to what Isaiah says. He says, "Whoever walks in deep darkness without light should trust in the name of the Lord and rely on his God." What's he saying here? As we live in this world, it can be really dark. It can be really chaotic and can be really unsettling, and you may not know where to go. It might be confusing and disrupting. And if you find yourself in that place, what does Isaiah say to do? Rely on the Lord. Look to the Lord in the darkness. But now watch what he says. "But watch out, be careful, when you who live in your own light and walk by your own light of your own fires." Walk by the light of your own fires. In other words, rather than doing what? Trusting the Lord in the darkness. We don't like the darkness, so what are we going to do? We're going to fix it by lighting our own fires. We'll get rid of the darkness. We don't have to trust God in the darkness, but we'll get rid of the darkness by trusting ourselves to create our own light. And then Isaiah warns, he says this, "This is what you will receive from me," the Lord speaking through Isaiah. "If you do this, you will in the end lie down in torment." Now, what is Isaiah saying here? Well, Larry Crabb called the people who do this firelighters. Firelighters. What are firelighters? Well, according to this passage, firelighters refuse to trust God in life's darkness and unpredictability. And if there's ever a time of darkness and unpredictability, we're not sure what's going to happen today or tomorrow or the next day, it's today. And God calls us to trust him in this darkness. Not that God would bring light to the darkness, but in the darkness, you can trust me. But we hate feeling out of control, so we find ways to manage life. I'm going to figure this out. That's a firelighter. I don't like the darkness. I don't like feeling out of control, so I'm going to find a way to be in control. And if I am in control, then I don't have to rely on who? God. And in the end, we see here that while we try to keep our life by managing it, in the end, what do? we lose our life. We lie down in torment. The lights of our own fires in the end aren't enough for the chaos and darkness and unpredictability of life. That's a self-protective relational style. In other words, a self-protective relational style, let me give a definition here, is a destructive pattern of relating committed to protecting ourselves from the unpredictability of life and relationships. Life is unpredictable, and every relationship that we have is unpredictable. And how do we do this? By relying on our own resources and abilities to control and manage those things instead of trusting God. Now, again, let me just show the character of this. We foolishly seek to manage those things we cannot control. That's part of fire lighting. It's idolatrous to its core because it refuses to trust God with the things that make us anxious. And what makes us anxious? The things that are unpredictable and we can't control. It's unloving in nature as it's ultimately committed to protecting ourselves above all else. I can be nice and I can do nice things for everybody else, but in the end, guess what? I'm going to protect myself. Love is a willingness to bleed for another person. Jesus loved and he bled. A self-protective lifestyle says, I'll be good and I'll do good things up to a point. And then when it comes to that point, whatever it is, guess what? You're on your own. Because I'm going to look out for me. And it bears destructive fruit we lay down in torment, since it is at odds with God's creational reality. God's story is moving this way, and a self-protective relational style moves us this way. Now, 3 observations I want to make about all this. First, despite what your wives might say, guys, you are a relational being. And because you're a relational being, we all have a relational style, okay? You have one, I have one. And the reason we all have one is because we were designed to be imagers of a triune God. A God who from the very beginning, before everything began, was relational in nature. Father, Son, and Spirit. We bear that image, and because of that, guess what? We are made primarily for relationships. You and I are relational beings. Okay? We were created to relate different than women relate. That's all part of God's design. But we are relational by nature. Second observation. Every man's relational style has a self-protective energy to it. We're made to relate, and so we relate, and we're made to relate in love. Men were built to bless. We're built to use our power to relate in ways to the environment, to people that blesses people. But rather than doing that, there's this self-protective energy in all of us that we're born with that says, rather than loving, I will protect myself. I will be about me. Now, where did that come from? Well, that comes from the fact that we are descendants of Adam. Remember what Adam did right after he sinned? In the garden, God says, Adam, have you eaten the fruit? And Adam, who was made to protect his wife and to protect the garden, to use his power to that end, to maintain the blessing and the goodness of that relationship, that marriage relationship, his wife and the world that God placed him in, what did Adam do? He threw his wife under the bus. It's the woman that you gave me. And it didn't stop there, because you go to Genesis chapter 4, and what goes on there? Cain kills his brother Abel. And so that, because we're descendants of Adam, we all have this self-protective energy that we have inherited from him. We're relational because we're imagers of God, but we're self-protective because we're descendants of Adam. Third thing, each one of us in this room have self-protective relational styles, right? Because we're image bearers and because we're descendants of Adam. But each of our relational styles is unique to ourselves. My relational style, while it may be self-protective, is very different than Vince's relational style, which is self-protective, which is different than Tim's, which is different than all of ours, Warren's, Mark's, etc. Why is that? Well, it's because while we're all images of God, and while we're all descendants of Adam, we are all sons of our own fathers, right? And as being sons of our own fathers, we were raised in different families, in different ways, with different values, in different contexts. And it's that begins to form our story and shape our relational style. And that then brings us to where our story was formed, its origin. The answer to that, you've already kind of heard it. Your story was formed in your family through the making of boyhood memories. Your family of origin, and in your family of origin, as you were growing up, things were happening and memories were being made. That's where your story with its self-protective vehicle was formed. Now notice, let me just kind of tease this out a bit here. As a boy, you had experiences with the world around you, friends, events, things happened. We all had experiences as boys growing up. You also had relationships with your family, with your mom, with your dad, whether it was good or bad or non-existent or whatever it might be, siblings, cousins, grandparents, all that. You had relationships with your family. So we all had experiences and we all had relationships that centered around our home. Now, as we were having these experiences and these relationships, there were four key questions, core questions, that we were unconsciously asking ourselves as we were growing up. First, am I safe? Are these experiences and these relationships making me feel safe? Second, am I seen? Do people see me? Do they notice me? Third, am I loved? Another way of putting it, do I belong? Am I accepted? And the fourth one for boys was, am I powerful? Can I make a difference in this world? Or maybe I can't. Another way to put it is, am I believed in? Now those four questions generated emotions depending on how they were answered. And they were answered by your experiences and your relationships in your family and your home. If they were answered in positive ways, I'm safe, I'm seen, I'm loved, I'm powerful, it generated feelings of security, of being valued, of belonging. If they were answered in negative ways, you didn't feel safe, seen, loved, or powerful, it generated emotions of vulnerability, of insignificance, of aloneness and isolation. Now, you take all those emotions and feelings that come from the experience and emotion, and those experiences and those emotions, positive and negative, create memories. And it's those memories from your boyhood that form your default operating system, your reaction to life, or what? Your story. And it's those experiences and emotions that create those memories that live in us also worked to shape your protective relational style, which is what? How we tell our story. Okay? In other words, our boyhood memories, experiences and emotions form our story and shape the relational style by which we tell it today. In other words, where was your story formed? In your family of origin. Through your experiences and relationships that created memories that shape your story and also form the way you tell your story. Now, let me just add something here, kind of a footnote, how your memory works. This is maybe will be helpful. Your brain loves predictability and it hates uncertainty. It's always working to create predictability and always working to avoid uncertainty. That's how God created our brain. And it uses memory to make sense of the past experiences and emotions where we felt predictability and where we felt uncertainty. Now, to make sense of our past experiences and emotions, what it does, it produces anxiety and fear so that it can anticipate an uncertain future. I don't know what's going to happen, so I'm going to be afraid and I'm going to be anxious. What does the fear and anxiety do? It gets me what? Ready. Nothing's going to surprise me. But it also produces a fight or flight response. And a fight or flight response is to help me react to a threatening present. So nothing is going to surprise me and nothing's going to overtake me. I'm ready for it to come. I'm ready for it to act. That way, I can have predictability and avoid uncertainty. And what I'm saying is, because the brain loves predictability and hates uncertainty, it uses and adjusts our memory, specifically from boyhood, to create those feelings of predictability and avoid uncertainty. Okay? Well, it also produces, I added this one on this morning, produces shame and contempt to create a confusing past. I don't understand how my past works, so I'll use shame and contempt, and that will explain it. For example, I'll show you how this works. An abused, and that's the key word, abused boy remembers. He was always bad, in quotes, just before his father would, quote, spank him. This is an abused boy, remembers that every time he got spanked, in quotes, he was always bad, end quotes. This memory is neither true nor accurate, because the truth is his father was a terrible abuser, and his son was not bad and didn't do anything. His father would be triggered by other things. He was an alcoholic and would just fly off the handle. So the boy's memory, how he remembers all this, is neither true nor accurate. And notice, his memory is also infused with shame and contempt. This spanking is all about shame. It's all about contempt towards myself. I am bad. Now, watch what this does. Even though it's not accurate, and even though it's filled with shame and contempt, it's the best way that he can make sense of his abuse. He can't explain why his father would do what he does. But he doesn't like the unpredictability. He wants a sense of predictability, because that's what his brain is looking for. So his brain arranges his memory to remember this. I was always bad just before my father hit me. It helps him anticipate an unpredictable future. I'll be safe if I control Dad's emotions by being a good boy. And so his brain produces anxiety and fear. And it helps him navigate a threatening present. I'll be safe from Dad's behavior by keeping distant in case Dad gets mad. And his brain produces the fight or flight. Let me just say this too. How does shame and contempt do with it? I got what I deserved. I got what I deserved. Well, it makes sense. It makes sense why my dad would do this to me, because I was bad. And when you're bad, guess what you deserve? This. It also makes him in control of his dad. Because if I'm bad and I just get what I deserve when my dad hits me, I can control my dad, and I can control this abuse by doing what? Being good. So I don't have to trust God with my confusion. I don't have to trust God in the darkness. I can light my own fire. It starts in childhood. And we just get better at it as we go along. Something else about memory. We have two kinds of memory. Maybe you're aware of this, maybe you're not. But it's important to point out. There's something called explicit memory, and there's something called implicit memory. What's the difference? Explicit memory recalls past experiences and emotions that accompanied it. Every experience has an emotion or connected to it. And the greater the emotion, the easier it is to remember it, okay? That's why it's so easy to lose your keys. There's not a lot of emotion connected with your keys, you know? You just kind of set it down and it's like, I don't remember. But if you've left your keys before, left them in the car, every time you get out of the car, there's that emotion that you remember of having, of the horror of, I locked my keys in the car. Now you always remember, okay? So it recalls past experiences and emotions that accompany it. This is called your conscious memory. The experience and emotions are connected. But the explicit memory remembers the emotions of the past without recalling the experience. In other words, there's the experience, but for whatever reason, it just kind of gets washed away. I don't recall the experience. But the emotions that accompany that experience are right there. A lot of times we do this when there's abuse. We will disconnect. I won't remember the event, but the emotions live within me and they come back to haunt us. That's what was going on with Simba. And this is the non-conscious memory, emotions without the experience. Now, I want us to focus for a minute on the implicit memory. Why? Well, the implicit memory is important to your story. Why? Because 80% of your story and my story are rooted in implicit memories. Emotions that we have living in us that are disconnected from the past events. So we don't recall the past events, but all these emotions that are connected with the past events are living inside of us. Okay? And we are unaware. We have these memories, but we're unaware when we're having them. You know why? Because the only time we're consciously aware of a memory is when we recall the event. But since we can't recall the event, when we're having the memory, all we have is the emotion. And so we're not aware that this is a memory. All we are aware of is I'm feeling some emotion. It's triggered, an implicit memory will be triggered by the experience or sensation in the present to a similar, that was similar to an implicit memory in the past. In other words, there's something happening to me in the present that feels or smells or is like this implicit memory, the event that happened in the past. I don't remember the event, but it triggers, it has similar emotions. And so it triggers not only emotions that are happening here, but it triggers these past emotions as well. So now you got two sets of emotions going on. You see that? Present emotions that the experience is triggering, and the past emotions that it's triggering. But the past emotions you're aware of, but you're not aware that it's being triggered by a past event. You see what happens with this? What we then do is we wrongly attach all these emotions here to the experience and the emotions here. And what happens then is you have this big blow up, and how I like to put it, you're giving a $100 reaction to a $5 event. Now, if it's a $5 event in the present, you should have a $5 reaction, right? But if you have a $100 event, it doesn't mean you're just just overreacting. No. What you're doing is you have an implicit memory being triggered, and $95 of that present reaction is coming from the past event. But since you don't understand that, and I don't realize that, what we do is we attach it all to the one. You got that? You can always tell when it's an implicit memory that's being triggered is when you have a $5 reaction, but you're giving it a $5 event, but you're giving it a $100 reaction. Or when a friend, there's a $5 event between you, and he or she or your wife gives it a $100 reaction. It's real, but $95 is coming from the past that we're typically not aware of. So how was your story formed? It was formed by your brain's desire to create predictability and security through the use of your boyhood memories, experience, and emotions. And it does so, it produces this predictability and security by producing contempt and shame to make sense of your past, which says, I deserved it, that's why it happened. I don't need to be confused, I deserved it. It produces anxiety and fear to anticipate the future. I will not be surprised, whatever comes, I'm ready for it. And it produces this fight or flight response, which is how we respond to the present, what we're in essence saying, I'm ready to act. And when you put all this together, this becomes your default operating system for doing life in a broken world, which is called what? Your story. Your story. So what's your story? And how can you know your story is really your story, or you just misunderstood it? Well, come back in 5 minutes and we'll talk about that. Okay, how can you know your story? And let's look at this. 4 thoughts. I want to begin. The first thought is this. Most men don't know their story. Most men don't know their story. There are several reasons I think this is true. First, it's not a category in their thinking. You know, I went through 4 years of seminary and then was a pastor for 10 years before I even had this category in my thinking. It wasn't until I went back and got my master's with Larry Crabb in counseling that this category of story ever came into my thinking. And so most of us don't have this category in our thinking. Another reason is most of men, I think, confuse it with their history or testimony. They talk about their story. Well, I'm going to tell my story. What do you mean by that? Well, they asked me to tell my story, what happened to me, how I got saved at church or in my small group. We're too afraid because we don't know what to do with it. It's just like this snake back here. I just want to leave it alone in case you touch it. It might bite me, and it's just too big and too powerful. I'll just avoid it. Or it's too infused with shame to face it. You know, there's just all these bad things that have happened that I just feel so much shame about, so much guilt about that, you know, I'll just do the Simba thing, Kuna Makata. It's too much work to deal with it. And it is, guys, it's a lot of work to deal with your story, to face your story, to seek to move it from that factory preset to a preset, to a setting that is more in line with God's story than our own story, how it begins. And some guys, they sincerely want to, but they just don't know how. Now, I don't know where you are in this, but if you are this last bullet point, I really want to know my story, but I don't know how, well then stick around because we're going to begin to talk about this process. And the process begins with, to know your story involves the long process of discovery. It's a process of discovery. It's not something you manufacture. Hey, I'd like to have this be my story, so I'm going to adopt it. This will be my story. There are no steps, techniques, or formulas. You know, you're not going to get 3 things to do today and you know what your story is. There's no single book, seminar, or retreat. You know, we have story weekends, but you know what? You go and you maybe get a little bit more understanding of your story, but it isn't going to be, you know, the whole thing, because it's a process. It takes time. In fact, it's discovered a little at a time over the course of your lifetime. I'm going through a kind of a spiritual discipline now, Ignatius kind of a thing, that I'm learning more of my story in some different ways, and I'm seeing things that I've never seen before. And it's making sense of how I relate and my style of relating and everything. And that allows me then to say, okay, God, what do I want to do with this? Whereas before, I didn't even see it. And I've been working on this, on my own story, since 1993. It requires desire, awareness, diligence, and community. You can't come to know your story in isolation. So it's a long process of discovery. Second, this process of discovering your story has to begin somewhere, and it begins, the most important thing, with stillness. Stillness. Now, what is stillness? How would you define that? Pardon me? Going limp. Okay. What else? How would you define stillness? Stillness isn't something we think a lot about, is it?
Introspection.
Okay, maybe some introspection. Although that could also create other things that aren't stillness. Solitude. Solitude can be the environment that creates stillness. Rest. Maybe an exhale. Okay, focus on God. Let me put it like this. Stillness is a learned mental habit. It isn't something that you accidentally do, because not only is there something in us that's always going to move as men in good ways, but there's always going to be something in moving us in bad ways. And that movement in bad ways, you know, is typically by shame, or typically we're told that, you know, you can't sit still, you know, because you're lazy, whatever it is. That was one of the messages I got from my dad, that, you know, you can never sit still because you can't be lazy. But it's a learned mental habit. And what does it involve? It involves quieting the constant noise, the monkey mind, that chatter that's going on inside us, all those distractions, the restlessness you feel in your body. Don't you just sometimes just sit down, you just feel like your body's just kind of buzzing? You just can't sit still, you know, and it's not ADHD or anything like that. It's just, you're just moving. And it often goes on inside us because it's so much a part of us. It goes on without our awareness. You know, I've said this before, and you've probably heard it. It's like asking a fish to tell you what is wet. What does it mean to be wet? Well, he can't tell you, primarily because he can't talk. But if he could, guess what? He wouldn't know how to define it because it surrounds him. And because it surrounds him, he's unaware of it. He becomes unaware of it. The monkey mind and all the chatter and all the distractions are so much a part of us, we're not even aware of it anymore. And we have a culture that we just absorb it from. I mean, you listen to the news. It doesn't matter what news you listen to. What does it make you want to do? You know? It discourages you from stillness. So how is it developed? It's developed by withdrawing from the constant stimulation of your mind and your body through the practice of silence and solitude. We stimulate our body with energy drinks. Got to keep it going. We stimulate our mind by always having to have noise on. You know, when you run, got to have music. When I'm driving in the car, got to be listening to something. Stillness is coming to the place of shutting all that stuff down, anything that stimulates the mind or the body. Now, there's appropriate places for stimulation of mind and body, but not 24/7. Now, what does stillness do? Stillness slows us down to notice things we are too busy too often to see. For example, you've seen the video on the internet. You can go, I forgot, just type it in, gorilla and that. And what it does, this is a psychological experiment. They'll tell you as you watch this, just notice how many times they pass the basketball back and forth. And I think they're trying to get it from each other, so keep your eye on the ball. So you're keeping your eye on the ball, and at the end, how many times? And so you're supposed to be able to have told them how many times the ball has passed hands. And then they say, did you see the gorilla? And you say, what gorilla? And when they slow down and they show it again, the gorilla's right there and he does a little jig and then he walks off. But you're so busy, you don't even see what's in plain sight. Let me give you a stillness exercise. I mean, on your way home, you can do this. Drive home with no radio on. If you cut the grass today, keep the headphones off. But try this. Set aside 5 minutes, and you might want to do it every day this week. Just try it. Find a place where you're comfortable. There's going to be no distractions, no kids, no phones, no possible disruptions, no music. It's just plain silent. And then set a timer so you don't have to be thinking about, okay, have I done 5 minutes yet? For 25 minutes.
25 minutes, starting now.
No thanks. Set the timer. Somebody's paying attention. Sit still and close your eyes and notice. And notice 3 things. Just notice the background noises. Maybe you'll hear cars in the background. Maybe you'll hear birds. Maybe you'll hear crickets at night, whatever it might be. Also notice all the chatter that's going on in your mind. Just notice it. Okay? Don't try to explain it. Don't try to get rid of it, because the more you try to get rid of one thing, you clomp onto it. And if there's chatter in your mind, just see it as kind of floating down the river. There it is, and there it goes. Just let it be there. And notice also the sensations in your body. You know, is your stomach tight? What's going on in your chest? Is your throat feeling kind of like closed off? You know, whatever it is. Just notice those. How your legs are on the chair, how your feet feel. You know, the ground feels beneath your feet. If you're outside, notice just how the sun or the wind is hitting your face. Just notice those things. That's all you do. What you're doing is you're taking away any stimulation, and you're just allowing yourself to be there, to slow down. Now, whatever you notice, again, don't obsess on it. Don't judge it. You know, you start slowing down and you start noticing things. It's like, oh, I'm having some pretty nasty thoughts here. Oh, I must be a bad Christian. Shame. No, if you notice it, don't judge it. Say, oh, that's there, and there it goes. Don't try to fix anything. Just acknowledge it and sit with it. That's hard to do. But it's necessary to do just to let all the stimulation stop. And if you can do this for 5 days, try it for 10. If you can do it for 10, try it for 21. And after 21 days, they say it's a habit. This would be a good habit to do, to learn. 5 minutes a day. And if you do it every day, you begin to develop stillness as a mental habit. And this mental habit is necessary if you are really determined to begin the process of discovering your story, because you cannot know your story without stillness. Why that? Why stillness? Oh, before I do that, let me give you something else. Here's another noticing tool, just to notice what's going on with you. It's called SIFT, S-I-F-T. It's an acronym. S stands for sensations, your bodily sensations. I stands for images, pictures you see in your head. F stands for feelings, what you're feeling. T stands for thoughts, the thoughts you're having or a story you're telling yourself. Now let me show you how this works. You can use this every day in any situation that you have. So say you have a discussion with a friend and you leave that discussion right away. What I want you to do is pause for a moment. I just had this discussion with this friend. And what you do is you pause for a moment and you quickly run through SIFT, S-I-F-T. Sensations, images, feelings, thoughts. And you ask yourself, what are the things that I felt during this conversation, during this interaction? And name it. Okay, I had this conversation with this guy, and sensations, what were some bodily sensations? I'm not aware of any. How about images? No, right now, no. Some feelings. Well, you know, I did feel a little guilty. I'm not sure why, but I did feel a little guilty now that I think about it. And thoughts. What was I telling? Well, I guess the thoughts I were having as I think about it now is, you know, I kind of didn't come through for him because he disagreed with one of my decisions. I should have come through for him, I guess, is the story I'm telling myself, and I feel guilty. Now you know what I'm feeling? I'm recognizing, I'm just kind of feeling this feeling in my gut. As I think about it now, I can kind of see this image of when I was a boy, how I could never do anything in my family that was right. And ask yourself then, are there any of these SIFT, these sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, that are similar to what I used to experience as a boy? Yeah. I used to feel guilty all the time because my dad would get mad at me or my mom wouldn't like what I did because my job was to always make them happy. And if I didn't make them happy, then there was something wrong with me, and I always felt guilty. And I always felt this in my... And what you do, you're beginning to connect what? The present and the past, which is necessary to know your story. Why? Because your story is built around what? Boyhood memories. And most of those memories are implicit memories that you don't remember the experience, but you do remember the emotion. This helps connect the past and the present. And it also then helps you become aware of what's happening to you in the present. It slows you down to have to notice. Some helps for developing stillness, a couple books, Ruth Haley Barton, The Invitation to Solitude and Silence, Into the Silent Land, Martin Laird, and then a prayer app that I use. You can get it on wherever you get apps at, Pray As You Go. I use this every morning. I take my dog out for a walk every morning, about 5 o'clock, and I use this. And at night, before I go to bed, I go outside and I'll walk, whatever, and I'll use their examine. It's on here. It's a prayer. And what they are, they're different kind of prayers. They cause you to have to slow down and think and be aware of where you may have seen God, where you may have been aware of God in the day, or what the word as they're reading it is stirring inside of you. So again, it's just some different ways that you can begin to learn to practice stillness. Okay? Next, you gotta slow down because stillness opens the door again to noticing. This is all about noticing. Noticing three key things. And without noticing these three key things, you cannot know your story. First, the context of your family of origin. I'll say something about that in a second. Second, the existence of your sacred stories. Within your story, there's some sacred stories. Not all your stories from the past, all the events and things you remember are sacred, but there are a few sacred stories, both positive and negative. And thirdly, the message of your, for lack of a better term, internal or inner interpreter, or I think I changed it as I go here in the slides, personal interpreter. We all have this kind of guy sitting on our shoulders telling us how we should understand what's going on, okay? We got to be aware of these things, is what I'm saying. Why? Because they're necessary for knowing your story. First, the context of your family of origin. We got to be aware of this. Why? Well, every story, whether you read it in the Bible, whether it's a Charles Dickens or whatever it might be story, has a context in which the story is written. And if you want to understand the story, you have to understand what? The context. If you don't understand the context, you can read it and not understand what the story is about. The story's context, it's important because the context defines the characters, who they are, what they're about. It sets the mood for the story. It creates the dynamics of what happens between the characters, what happens in the story itself, and it shapes the entire direction of the story, where the story is going to go. We won't know any of that without knowing the context. Now, your family of origin is the context for your story. Your family of origin, the family that you grew up in as a boy. As your context, your identity was defined by your family. As your context, the mood by which you expect to experience the world was set by your family. There's a way we expect the world is going to come to us, in which we have these expectations, and most of the time we're not even aware of it. That's the mood of your story, and that was set by the context of your family. And thirdly, the direction that your life is going to take is shaped by your family. Your family is your context in which your story is written. Another way of putting it, it's your family, it's your factory preset. This is where the default setting comes. It comes from your family of origin. For example, we all receive story-forming messages from our parents as a boy. By the way they interacted with you, parents relate to you, they interact with you, they treat you in certain ways, good, bad, indifferent. Did you feel safe, seen, loved, and powerful? Your parents are going to answer those questions for you by the way they interact with you. They may say, oh, you're safe, you're loved, we love you, but it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to feel it. And the brain and memory operates not on the words, but on the feelings that were experienced. And then, again, this forms our identity by the way our parents interacted with us. By the way they lived their lives before you. Not only did they interact with you, but they lived in the world and you watched them. And as you watched them, you absorbed their story with all its pain, fears, hurts, relational styles, and beliefs about the world. This formed the mood by which, oh, if that's how the world is, then that's, for them, that must be how the world is going to be for me. So what they expect is what I will expect. Thirdly, by the unspoken rules they implanted in you. Now, there were rules in your home and there were rules in my home, But then there were unspoken rules in your home and unspoken rules in my home, and we all knew it, but maybe we couldn't say them, not because you'd get in trouble if you did, but it was just expected, and it was so much a part of the expectation. It was like the fish being wet. It's just what it was. And the message was this, really, these unspoken rules. To be part of this family, you must only think and feel and act in a way that doesn't make us, your parents, feel uncomfortable. Because if you think, feel, and act in any other way, it's going to make us uncomfortable. And we don't like to be uncomfortable. We don't like unpredictability. We like predictability. And we want our kids not to add to our unpredictability, but add to our security. So if you want to be part of this family, you got to think, feel, and act and believe this way. And so guess what? I want to be part of this family. I don't want to be alone. I want to be loved. So guess what we all do? We unknowingly throw all the things away in order to be safe. That's how I'll think. That's how I'll feel. My dad says, "You're not cold?" "I'm cold, Dad." "You're not cold?" "Why?" "Because I'm not cold. So you shouldn't be cold." "Oh, okay, then I'm not cold." You don't have a way to feel different than I do. You don't have a right to feel different than I do. We all grew up in homes like that. This forms the direction of our lives. Did you want to get that, Tim? Yeah. I don't have a way to quickly go through that. There. Okay? In other words, as a boy, parental messages set the context for your story. Messages spoken and unspoken. And as a man, those messages creates a family context that also works to produce inside of each of us an internal template by which we are going to see life, by which we are going to see the world. We look at the world and we see life through this template that we all have in us as a result of the homes we grow up in. That's why we can all have a self-protective style of relating, but it's all unique to ourselves. Because we all have different templates by which we see life and then have to deal with life, the unpredictability and the uncertainty of it. Now, our boyhood memories define our identity. This is who you are. This is who I am. Our adult experiences, because we're looking through the template, only work to reinforce that identity. Our boyhood memories set life's mood. This is how I will experience the world. Our adult experiences only work to reinforce the mood by which we expect to experience the world. Why? Because we have this template. This is how it's going to come to you. Oh, so the only way I'm going to see it is that way. Our boyhood memories shape your direction. It shapes my direction. This is how I must think and be and feel and act to be okay. To be safe, secure, seen, and powerful. And our adult experiences only then work to reinforce the direction our life is taking. Why? Because we see life as it comes to us through that internal template. Mark?
Is there some, I know there's not an exact point where as a boy and as a man separates, but is there some, like, are we talking about only like, 6 or 8 years old as a boy, or are we talking 15, 16, 18?
I think it's all developing, and I think it can go in different directions, but it all develops, and a lot of it is not only the messages, but how we're wired. We're going to respond to things not only from the environment, but from how God has created us, how he wired us to be, to think. Now, this is our default operating system. Our identity, mood, direction, it's all reinforced by our adult experiences. But this is the factory preset, the boyhood memories that define our identity, mood, and direction. Okay? And again, unless we specifically do something about the preset, nothing's going to change. And let me say this. Just reading your Bible, going to a small group, and going to church on Sunday, and maybe serving at the church, isn't going to change the preset. It isn't going to change the preset. It can help, but more has to be done. Now, what's the problem with our family context? You have one, I have one. What's the problem? Well, the family context, how we are defined, the mood we experience life, the direction our life takes, will always be at odds with the direction of God's story. Our family context moves us in this direction instead of moving us in this direction. And so to live into God's story, what do we have to do? We can't ignore the family context. We must begin to confront it. Second thing, stillness helps us to notice the existence of your sacred stories. The existence of your sacred stories. Again, we all have a story, our default operating system, but within this default operating system, there's some key programs, some sacred stories that are really powerful in terms of how they influence how we think, how we feel, how we live. Now, what's a sacred story? A sacred story, how I'm defining it, you all have one, is a boyhood experience whose memory, for whatever reason, remains with you today. We all have some memories where you think, I say, tell me some boyhood memories. Probably there'll be one or two that come to your mind right away. It might be a positive one, it might be a negative one. For whatever reason, if I say, why does that memory stick with you? Well, maybe it sticks with you because it was a really important thing, or maybe, I don't know, it's just, for whatever reason, it's just there, and I always just remember it. We all have those. Now, your story, as I said here, contains a few sacred stories that are both positive and negative in nature. And your sacred stories combine together to unconsciously define, now get this, guys, to unconsciously define our perception, or your story's, my story's perception of life and death. What is life and what is death? Well, your story has a way of thinking about that. There's a way that you perceive what life is, and there's a way that you perceive what death is. And our sacred stories define that. Now, why do you think it's important? What's the power that those sacred stories have? What do we know about how God has created us? As image bearers, we were designed for life. We were designed to image God, a living God, who designed us to do what? To pursue life, to create life, to bring life. And everything in us pursues life, and if we're pursuing life, everything in us is going to do what? Avoid death. Anything that feels like death. So we naturally pursue life, pursue those things that feel like life. There are things that you experience today that will feel more like life than other things. And there are other things that will happen to you today that will feel more like death than other things. And guess what you will do? You will pursue more of those things, and you will work to avoid those things that feel like death. We all do that. Why? Because we're made in the image of a living God, and we were made for life, to pursue life, to bring life, to give life. Now, our sacred stories unconsciously direct our story toward that which felt like life in boyhood, and to avoid or to turn away from those things that felt like death in boyhood. What do I mean? Here's an example of a positive sacred story, a boyhood experience. guy's name happens to be Scott. This is one of my sacred stories. Scott made a play at second base. I was 10 years old, I think, Little League, that got a standing ovation, not just by his team, but by the other team and all the fans in the stadium. Everybody stood up and clapped. In fact, when I looked and I had the ball, I started clapping. The emotional memory, Scott felt seen, recognized, and admired by others for what? Standing out. It just wasn't a good play. It was a spectacular play. Now, there's an old saying, it says, what fires together, wires together. Spectacular play, being seen, recognized, and admired. What fires together, wires together, and it produces an emotional perception of life. So, what does that sacred story tell me what life is? For Scott, life is feeling seen, recognized, and admired for standing out from others. Whenever I feel that, that feels like I'm alive. Contrast that with a negative sacred story. We all have them. A boyhood experience that I had, Scott's dad took Scott's friend, Bob, out on the boat without inviting Scott. They were just gone. And there I was, left standing on the dock. The emotional memory that I had was Scott felt unseen, unrecognized, and undesired by his father. Again, what fires together, wires together. Scott's dad, forgetting Scott, feeling unseen, unrecognized, and undesired by his father, produces an emotional perception of death. This is what feels like death to me. For Scott, death is feeling unseen, unrecognized, and undesired by others, especially from those he admires. It isn't just everybody, it's certain people. I admired my dad. My dad was my hero. And so I look for that from others. Even now, one of the best things that feels most life-giving to me is when I know that I can please somebody that I admire. That's always what I always want to do for my dad. But the message my dad gave me was, he didn't see me, he didn't recognize me, he didn't desire me. Alexa, stop. Now note the power of my sacred stories, how they set the direction for my life. You can kind of see that if you know me, can't you? Life for Scott, and I'm going to pursue anything that feels like life, is feeling seen, recognized, and admired for standing out. As a result, I will pursue life by working hard to be seen, recognized, and admired for always being the best. Not just doing my best, but for standing out. I have to be the best. I don't have to be the best in everything, but just at what I do. Again, it has to be spectacular. I need both teams to stand up and the fans to stand up, because that feels like life. And I'll struggle with closeness because this is what I do. I'll struggle with closeness because if you're always having to be spectacular, you can't let people get close. You're too busy. With anxiety, am I going to do enough? Jealousy, well, why aren't I getting that? That should be mine. And the inability to slow down. See how that now begins to shape my life, my definition of life? Death for Scott was feeling wrongly. And it was wrong. Why? Because my dad should have seen me. My dad should have recognized me. My dad should have desired me. Feeling wrongly unseen, unrecognized, undesired. And so I will avoid anything that feels like that, anything that feels like death. And what I'll do is I will avoid death by overachieving, working hard to be the best so that as to never disappoint. And if I'm not sure I can be the best, guess what? I won't do it. I wrestled at Moody. And I was okay, I was pretty good. But what I found is I would only be as good as the person, just a little better if I could beat them, as the person that I was wrestling. Because I didn't want to know what my best was. I was too afraid that it wouldn't be good enough. And when I define death like this, I'm going to always struggle with envy. Now, jealousy is somebody taking from me what I think should be mine. And so if I'm doing this, don't anybody get in the way of taking it from me. Envy is, you're getting what I really want. So I'm going to struggle with envy, exhaustion, and feeling misunderstood and used. Because if you just understood me, then you'd see that I really am doing this good. I'm not a bad guy. You should desire me. And used. Why? Because I can never say no. I always got to please. But when you please and you don't feel admired and seen in return, after a while you just get mad. Now here's my question. What's the problem with these two sacred stories? Answer: they don't reflect God's definition of life and death in his story. My smaller story says life is being seen, recognized, and admired, and death is being unseen, unrecognized, and unadmired. It's life and death is an objective to be managed by effort. God's larger story defines life as connection to God in Jesus, John 17:3, and death is alienation from God in Jesus, Revelation 21:8. It's a relationship to be received by trust, as opposed to an objective to be managed by effort. And when I view it my way and God views it his way is creational reality, as mine is my own perceived reality, it's going to prevent me from living into God's story, right? Why? Because my definition of life and death is going to move my whole life story in this direction, and God's story is moving in the other direction. And so without knowing my own definitions, how I perceive life and how I perceive death, I won't be able to, there will be barriers getting in the way that I'm not even aware of. So here's a couple questions to ponder. What is your best boyhood memory? Whatever it is, how has that positive memory, it's probably one of your sacred stories, shaped your definition of life? And how have you pursued that definition of life over the years? You'll see it if you take time to discover it. What's your worst boyhood memory? And how has that negative memory, which is probably one of your sacred stories, shaped your definition of death? And whatever your definition of death, however you perceive death, how have you avoided that definition of death over the years? And then here's the last question. Have your definitions of life and death prevented you from living into God's story? That's the core question. And the answer is, yes, they have. And so then, stillness opens our eyes to notice three things: the context, the existence of sacred stories, and finally, real quickly, the message of your personal interpreter. Let me just quickly go through this because I know we're running out of time here. Your personal interpreter, your inner interpreter, is that part of your brain that takes the internal template that was formed, remember we talked about that, by your family context and sacred stories, how you see life, takes your present experience, sensations and emotions, and in a nanosecond, it synthesizes it all together into a single message of what the present experience or situation means for you and how you need to respond to stay safe. All that happens in a split second. For example, this would never be you, or especially never be me, a man getting ready for work, and his wife says, "Are you going to wear that to work?" Your personal interpreter says, it's a story you're telling yourself, she thinks you're stupid when it comes to clothes. No, she just thinks you're plain old stupid. Now, that isn't necessarily in the forefront of your mind, but that's there, below the surface. And you know it's there because immediately your body floods with shame and anger. You're having that $100 reaction to a $5 event. And it's similar to what you felt as a boy when your family laughed at you for how you cut the lawn. You don't know how to do anything, do you? You begin to speak. Who do you think you are? My mother? I'll get you. And you act. You quickly stomp away to let her know, I'm really mad. None of us do that. But if we do, you know what? It all happens in a brief moment, doesn't it? Without even thinking. But there are things going on that cause us to do this. And the crazy part is your wife is there puzzled and confused and hurt because she just wanted to know, maybe you need to have that, I'll iron it for you, you know. But she then gets angry because her personal interpreter says what? My husband thinks I'm whatever. And so she acts and reacts, and it brings up emotions from her, implicit memories from her childhood. And you see how the cycle then goes? Note about your personal interpreter. Its message may or may not be true. It may be that your wife was criticizing you. It may not be. But it feels true based on the implicit memories from boyhood. Its message is the cause of the emotions and words and actions that follow, not your wife. She doesn't cause them. It's these implicit memories that are coming up to the surface that she's just triggered, and she doesn't even know she's triggered them. Its message will always validate your self-protective relational style because that's how you protect yourself as a kid. You reacted and you ran away. And that's how you do it today. Its message is just below the waterline, whispering in your ear. Tell your wife we'll be done in just a second. That's the wrong phone. It's without awareness. Without awareness of your personal interpreter, you become a slave to him. You're going to just do whatever he tells you. I don't want to get mad and yell and scream and stomp off. But why do I do it every time? There's a reason you have this personal interpreter. Your personal interpreter creates invisible barriers preventing you from fully living into God's story. You see how that happens? There's a whole lot more to telling your story than going on a weekend retreat, isn't there? That's a good place to start. But it's much more complex and deeper than that. Here's just an exercise you can do to get to be aware of your personal interpreter. Consciously ask yourself when you're interacting with people, consciously ask yourself these questions. What's the story I'm telling myself right now? That's your personal interpreter. Whatever the story you're telling yourself, it may be true, it may not be true, but it's the story you're telling yourself. Well, he does that because he thinks I failed him. Well, maybe he doesn't feel that, but that's the story I'm telling myself. And when I tell myself that story, how do I feel? I feel guilty. And when I tell myself that story and I feel guilty, how do I react? Well, I get defensive. And I maybe start attacking. And what hurts about that story? Well, I just feel misunderstood because that's not how I was wanting him to see this. I'm not a bad person like he's thinking I am. I want to be seen as good. And what does all that remind me of from my boyhood? Because I can guarantee you it does. A $5 event that gets a $100 reaction is coming from your story of the past. So what have we seen today? We've seen what our story is. It's your default operating system for doing life. How is your story being told? It's told through your self-protective relational style. Where was your story formed? In your family of origin, through boyhood memories. And how do you know your story? How can you come to know your story? By developing habits of stillness and awareness that allows you to see and be aware of family context, sacred stories, and a personal interpreter. If I could just give an overview, guys, and this just kind of brings it all together. At our deepest core, we long to be safe, seen, loved, and powerful, right? These are all God-given longings that are necessary for masculine thriving. If you want to thrive as a man, this is what's necessary. But because we live in a broken world, amongst broken people, those longings are going to be disappointed by the world and by the people around us. We're not going to feel all the things we want to feel. Life in this fallen world will always disappoint my longings and triggers fears and shame. Why not? I must be bad. And that works, those experiences and those emotions create a memory that's alive inside of me. Well, that memory then works because I'm a fallen person, not just the world and people around me, but me too. Rather than trusting God with the darkness, rather than trusting God, I light my own fire. I'm going to create a sense of security. I'm going to bring light to this darkness. If God won't protect me or give me what I want, I will make it happen on my own without Him. And so we began early as a boy learning coping mechanisms, ways I can bring light to my darkness so I don't have to trust God. And as I get older, that produces my self-protective relational style. Based on my strengths, my wiring, my past coping strategies as a boy, I will find a way to relate to this world that gets me what I want. And there's your fully formed story. That's how it all comes together. So, what's our goal? Our goal as men is to live into God's story. But before we can do that, guys, we have to align our story with God's story. We got to know God's story. But assuming we know God's story, we then have to align our story with God's story. But before we can align our story with God's story, we first have to what? Know our story. You can't know your story. You can't align your story if you don't know your story. And you got to know where your story is misaligned. But before you can know where your story is misaligned, you have to know the real story you're telling. You got to know your story. Remember, as you work on knowing your story, God isn't asking us that we like our story or the directions He's taken. You don't have to like your story. God isn't telling you that. You don't have to pretend your story is better than it really is. Some of us have awful stories when you think about all the tragedies. We don't have to deny our story's tragedies or failures or disappointments or injustices. You don't have to pretend your story is something other than it is. And God isn't asking you to do that. But what God is asking is that we acknowledge the full truth of our story just as it is. He already knows it, so we're not going to tell Him anything He doesn't know. And even though He knows it, He still loves us, right? And then, as we acknowledge this full truth, we need to sit with our story without judging it, fixing it, or excusing what we see. Just be with our story. Because if we're trying to fix it or excuse it, guess what we're not doing? We're not being still. God asks us to be still with our story before Him. And here's where it really comes in. We're still with our story, we're sitting with our story, and we allow ourselves to feel its full weight. The crushing nature of our story, given its tragedies, the guilt and shame of our story, given our own failures, the fears, all of that. We feel its full weight, but always and only in the context of God's love. Without the context of God's love, your story and my story will crush us. And we will live like Simba. In other words, what we do is this. This is my story, whether I like it or not. I can't wish it away. I can't work it away. I can't hate it away. I can only accept it as it is. And we hold it and we bear its weight, but if we bear it without God's love, it will crush us. So we bear it in the context of God's love for us in Christ. And as we do, guys, the message that we begin to recognize within ourselves is I don't have to like my story. But I can begin to accept it because God knows my story, and through his love for me in Jesus forgives what needs to be forgiven, comforts what needs to be comforted. He redeems what needs to be redeemed, and he does this by inviting me into his larger story. He doesn't allow me to live outside his story. Through Christ, he allows me to join him in his story, where the comfort and forgiveness and the redemption begin to take place. And it's there that my story, as it's joined with his story, has a hope that this is going to turn into something far beyond I could ever imagine. That my story, your story, is going to have an ending. Not just a good ending, but a great ending. Why? Because we're becoming part of the greatest story ever told as we learn to live our story into God's story. And it's important we do that in the context of God's love, because apart from doing it that way, knowledge of our story will be superficial at best. The mood of our story will be characterized by naivete or contempt. I won't look at it, or I'll hate what I see. And any hope of realigning my story to live into God's story will be fruitless. So, closing question. How can we know what parts of our story are aligned with God's story, and what parts of our story are misaligned with God's story? How can we know that? Because that's important to know. Because it's those misaligned parts that are preventing us from fully living into God's story. Well, if you're interested in answering that question, come back next time. Because we're going to look at the topic, not all stories are created equal. See you next time.